Well, Happy New Year to everybody. We've been sent our first case for 2016, and I would like to go through this. It looks like it's an immediate placement on site number 30 for a patient, and let's go through and figure it out and see what's going on. I just wanted to, this dentist asked me to simply review the plan, and we'll kind of go from there. What I always like to do is I always like to start by looking at our checklist in evaluating our plans. What I do find is that when we go with the checklist, typically we will self-catch any mistakes that we have. So what I've done here is I've duplicated the plan so we can compare my corrected plan to the original plan, and we'll go and see how it looks. So as usual, what I would like to do in this particular case is start with what type of guide this would be, and I would call this a digital workflow guide. That means that our choices would be OptiGuide, DigiGuide, or CEREC Guide 2. All not requiring a scan, but dependent on getting the CEREC data in. The good news is we do have CEREC data. The not perfect news on this situation is the amount of CEREC data that we have, going from essentially tooth number 31 through, let's call it 24, is the minimum requirement for the OptiGuide. Would be more than enough for a DigiGuide and more than enough for a CEREC guide. Just briefly telling you that I probably would not look at a CEREC guide as an ideal placement technique for the immediate placement in this site, simply because the hand placement of the CEREC guide would allow too much potential for the implant to go side to side. So I would look for a fully guided solution utilizing either the OptiGuide or the DigiGuide here. So in looking at our plan, we can see that this implant has been planned for a 5x15 Noble Active. I do like that implant in the sense that it is a very good aggressive implant to help with primary stability. So let's go ahead and evaluate our plan using our checklist. So the first thing that we'll look at is mesiodistally, and what we're looking at here is mesiodistally. How does this implant look? Is it pretty well centered between the teeth? Do we have adequate amount of room? So in looking at this, just to draw here, I would say, are we pretty well centered here to here? Are they roughly equal? And what we can see in this is that our distal is shorter than our mesial, and the reason this becomes a little bit important is in terms of emergence profile. So what we have here is the potential for our emergence profile to allow us to have a little more of a food trap and a cantilever force here on the mesial of the implant. Now this is hardly a big issue in this particular case, but again, when we're doing this initial planning or the review of our plans, we're going to look at this at a very critical level so that we can always learn in what we're doing here. So I would like to see this a little bit better centered, probably somewhere along that line. And again, what that would allow us to do now is to have a much better emergence profile, okay, and less of a food trap, and we're probably a little bit more equal in that way, okay. So that's what I'm looking at there. Now buccal lingually, how do we look? And again, when we look at this, I'm going to go ahead and design out, there's my buccal, there's my lingual, how does my distance look? And what I can see here is the lingual is longer than the buccal. So my preference would be to go ahead and move this to the lingual. Now the other thing I will look at here is we can see right here that there's the central groove. Right here is our central groove, but we have our implant going just buccal to the central groove. So my preference would be to go ahead and lingually move this to line it up. So I would look something like that. And what this also does is gives us a little better spacing right there, okay? Next on our list would be bone level. Now with immediate placement, this becomes a little bit trickier. So this is a very common issue that I see in our plans when reviewing them, is we have a tendency oftentimes to evaluate our bone interproximally like so and look like it's there. But what we do know is that our bone in real life is scalloped. So while it may be right here interproximally, what we do know in on the buccal and lingual, that bone probably does something along those lines. Hence we get that architecture and everything. And the other thing that we can also look at right here is our bone level is right there on the lingual, right there on the buccal. Okay, so we can visualize that. Now what this shows me right here is that right now our implant is essentially at the level of bone. At the level of bone. And what we do know, I'm talking about buccal lingually, what we do know is that when we take the tooth out, there will be some bone resorption, so we do need to accommodate and plan for that. So I would probably recommend in this particular case dropping this implant down to about right there or so. Now, these things have a tendency to look very deep on the x-rays, but nonetheless, we do need to have the implant covered in bone on the buccal and lingual, and my experience has shown that this type of depth actually works out unbelievably well. It gives us plenty of room for a nice emergence and is quite predictable. So do plan on some loss of bone there from the extraction itself. Next we'll look at vital structures, and in this particular case our vital structures are four things. Number one, first and foremost, is going to be the nerve. We can see the nerve is mapped here and the nerve is way down here, so there would be absolutely no reason to worry about the nerve unless we went in and put some crazy implant like that lung in there, which would be unnecessary. So the nerve is non-issue. Number two, vital structure will be the submandibular fossa. So right here again we got plenty of room, no submandibular fossa concern. Number three would be our buccal plate. I do consider the buccal plate as a vital structure. You do want to avoid perfing through that buccal plate from an aesthetic and hygiene reason, tissue reason. And then number four would be the interproximal teeth. You don't want to run into roots. So here we can see that we're all good on all of those fronts. Okay, so now we get to the tooth portion of this, and now we're going to look at the occlusal table, and that's what I call here in the axial view. And this is after we moved it. So I'm going to go back and jump to the original plan and take a look at it in the axial view. And what we see here in the axial view is that our original planning, again, like I said, this is the original plan. There's the space to the mesial, and there's the space to the distal. So we can clearly see that our implant is tilted or cheats to the distal a little bit. If I were to take a guess here, I would say that the center is probably more along right in here is where we want that center of that implant to be. And so we need to move probably 2 or 3 millimeters right there. So again, so let me go back to our plan after we made corrections. And by the way, that also coincides with what we talked about earlier in the mesiodistal positioning there. So probably somewhere along that line. So now when we look at this, we can see that our implant is much better centered. In fact, it's probably actually a little too far mesial at this point. So there compared to there. So we would actually want to go ahead and tilt this thing back to the distal, just like so. Okay, so that's a better positioning there. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the occlusal plane. And in the occlusal plane, what I'm looking for here in the tangential view is I would like to see my occlusal plane look correct, and what we do know is this is incorrect. So ideally I would probably want my occlusal plane to look something like that. In doing that, we again went back to the distal again, but we need to go ahead and just move it back to the mesial there. So that's probably a little bit better there. Now, what we do have to keep in mind here is in doing that to get my occlusal plane correct, now we have a greater gap here mesiodistally, which will possibly lead to a food trap right here. So sometimes we have to make that decision to compromise our occlusal plane to get a proper emergence profile and emergence there. So that'll look a little bit better, probably doing something more along those lines right there. A little bit of a compromise. So our sleeve position looks great, and then we'll do our 360, And 360, what I'm evaluating here is, do we have enough implant in bone? We can see that we're in fresh bone right here. We're in fresh bone right there. So as we go through this, we can see that we do have a good chance of achieving stability. And that stability is probably one of the reasons that in this particular case we chose to use such a long implant. One of the things we do have to be careful with in using such a long implant is, will the patient open wide enough to be able to get a 15 millimeter, and this I've dropped it down to a 13 millimeter implant here, but originally planned for a 15 millimeter implant. Will the patient be able to open wide enough to get that in there? And I would tell you that in today's day and date, I'm not using much longer than a 13 millimeter implant very often. Certainly not for single unit cases. Certainly maybe from some of our full arch cases we're using 13 or longer sometimes. But these cases not so much. And I would even look to see if my 11.5 has a good chances of achieving stability here. Certainly using a guided system that will help maintain trajectory and maintain that implant in the right angle. That's fine. So, knowing what I would do in this case is, I would probably say on the safe end and use a 13 millimeter implant, but I doubtful that I would go to a 15 millimeter implant for this. So now we can go up here and clip along the active slice, and we can take a better look here and see that our implant is pretty well centered in this tooth, and looks pretty good there. The only thing I would critique here now is lower teeth have a tendency to be tipped a little bit lingually, so I would want to have my implant tipped a little bit lingually. So what I'm going to do here is tip my implant, and in tipping my implant I've moved it to the lingual, and then I'll just translate or bodily move my implant to the buccal a little bit to get it centered. And now we can see that our implant is now going with the flow of the lower teeth. So hopefully this was helpful and made sense. Some minor tweaks here, nothing unbelievably major done, but always the little things that make the difference. Thank you very much, and look forward to future cases.